Welcome to everybody. Do please, as I say, sorry to repeat myself, but if you've just joined us, do please say hi in the chat. And if you can give us an idea, make sure that your name in the list of participants, we can see who you are so we can talk to each other. That would be great. My name is Torreggiani. I am CEO of the Audience Agency, and I'm doing the Skillset seminar here today with my lovely colleague, Jonathan. Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, I am Jonathan, and my role is as a senior consultant, and I actually take responsibility for working on our international projects. And this, a lot of what we're talking about today comes from one of our major international projects, a European funded project called Adeste Plus. So looking forward to talking to everyone about this later on.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, and it is in fact the last one of a whole series of events that we've done actually related to that programme, so we'll be telling you a little bit about that. So what are we going to do today? As usual, I've covered up the screens with all these bits and pieces. So today we are going to be talking a little bit of theory, and then we're going to be having a little bit of practice. So that's how we've got 2 hours altogether, and we're going to kick off with just thinking a little bit about the state of audience development today, and in a way why we've developed this very particular programme that we're going to be talking about for most of the day, in response really to some frustrations about the way so-called audience development is or isn't working. We're then going to dive in and actually have a go, start thinking about how we put some of these things into practice. So we'll be doing a little bit of reasonably participatory activity. John will be talking a bit more about experiences, audience experiences and what that means, and then thinking a little bit about some of your work. So we'll have a little thinking time and or break from 2 o'clock until 2:15 UK time. So just having a little break to think about applying this thinking to your own work. And then taking a break then, and we'll start again at 2:15, and we'll be doing something fairly interactive at that point, thinking about designing an experience, and a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A, and we'll be finishing at 3 o'clock. So just to say, of course, we are very much just scratching the surface of this huge area. In fact, we've developed some summer school formats for doing some of this stuff much more in depth online, and we would love to hear from you at the end in the evaluation. If this is something you'd like to do more in depth, we're just looking at our own work over the next year or two, and we'd be quite interested to know if you'd like to do something, you'd be interested in doing something more in depth around this subject area. So if, with your permission all, I'm going to dive in and, as I say, talk a little bit about the state of audience development today and why we have developed this ACE project. So I've called this first section, Audience Development is Dead, Long Live Audience-Centered Experience Design. And I'll explain to you why as we go along. So, Javier, I'm just going to say I can see you. Oh no, I can't see you. That's a shame. I was going to say I can see somebody here. It's just nice to know that if I'm not making sense or going too quickly, actually, Jonathan, can you let me know? And anyone in the chat, please feel free to put questions to let me know if I'm talking too quickly. If you don't understand something, one of us will be monitoring that all the time, and we can intervene and stop and step in. Okay, so textbook audience development. So there are lots of definitions of the shady area that is known as audience development, a concept that I think, you know, we probably accept is quite influenced by practice in the UK for those of you outside. But as a concept, we tend to think as the audience agency, not an uncommon definition here, that audience development is a planned organisation-wide approach to extending the range and nature of relationships with the public based on an understanding of their needs. So this is within a cultural organisation context. So it helps a cultural organisation to achieve its mission, balancing social purpose, financial sustainability and creative ambition. So for us, this idea of audience development is very much linked to the notion of a triple bottom line. Most cultural organisations are having to do something really complicated to stay financially resilient, but actually, of course, probably much more interested in their creative and social purposes as organisations. But audience development is a key part of being able to do that. And as we've said, the notion of whole organisations pulling together to think about what they do for their stakeholders and their public is what underlies the idea of audience development for us. Not an uncommon definition. Most definitions of audience development, though, have this notion of wider, more people involved, deeper, more people involved, more deeply, more people involved, just getting more people engaged, and then this notion of increasing usually the social demographic diversity of who's involved. So these ideas are all very much bound up with common conceptions about what we mean by audience development. We often see lots of academics and non-academics often refer to this audience development matrix as a way of explaining that notion of wider, deeper, more and more diverse. We often think about the kind of link between program and audiences. If the bottom, if along the bottom we're thinking about product and program, and then across the top we're thinking about existing audiences or new audiences, we have this this quadrant idea, a 2x2 matrix, thinking about in the first instance, we want to take our existing audiences on a journey. We want to find more audiences like our existing audience. We want to take our existing audiences on journeys and introduce new products and experiences to them. And then of course we want to find new audiences through new programs, new ways of doing things. So this is quite often used, it's often that marketing and soft matrix, so you developed in the 50s, but we quite often find theories of audience development using this basic concept as a way of explaining what we mean by audience development. But is it actually working? So I think we have to come on to this idea that, excuse my strange animations there, excuse me, I need to go back one, don't I? Is it actually working? So I think what we can say is that, particularly in a UK context, we've seen very, very sophisticated approaches to marketing developing over the last few years, and we have got really good at perhaps talking to our own audiences. We certainly have seen overall, when we look at the data, we've seen that by and large, people do a bit more, they're more frequent, they spend a bit more than they used to, and so on. So we've been very successful in helping to increase penetration among the convinced, if you like, those people who are already persuaded. We've also seen organisations, successfully in bringing, bring great innovations into the way that they work with existing audiences. We've seen slightly less success, I think, in truth, in a very overarching sense, when we think about, developing new audiences a bit like our existing ones. We've tended to see sort of much more of a blockage. It tends to be the same people that keep on doing most of the arts and culture in the UK. And we've certainly really struggled on any sustained basis to find new audiences as a whole sector, particularly from different demographic groups, from those people. If we look at the stats over many years, we can see a very, very stable group of the population engaging a lot with arts and culture, and not a huge change elsewhere. Now, that's not strictly true on a kind of case-by-case basis, because we do have lots of evidence and lots of examples of projects which have been really successful at reaching completely different audiences. We've not so much reaching, but engaging completely different audiences. We've proved that we do know how to attract and how to make relationships with all kinds of different communities, except that we're not very good at doing it on a completely sustained basis. So let's come on to some of these ideas now. So thinking about when we think then about audience development, so we've got this notion of more, wider, deeper, more diverse, but we've also got ideas about how you do audience development well. So the principles of audience development, again, you'll see this in lots of literature. These are the things that we tend to think about as an organisation, but they're very much reflected in all sorts of other literature. So this idea that it's not about projects or campaigns, but much more about an ongoing strategy for change. So the notion of audience development, it has this idea of change in it. It is about taking our audiences or our communities on a journey. So it's not about a one-off project. Notionally, audience development has always been about a strategy and ongoing change, that it should flow from our mission and purpose. But it's an organisation-wide concept, that it was always, the very first ever mention of audience development talked particularly about people working in education, marketing and programming, working in a much more joined up kind of way. In fact, it was a sort of response to the idea that these new disciplines, in fact, back in the sort of early 90s, were perhaps becoming fragmented in the way that they were working. So this notion of being integrated is very important. hugely important idea from our point of view is that it's based on real evidence, that we listen to what our audiences are telling us, we understand who our communities are, what their needs are, and so on, and that is the basis on which we do audience development, and that we understand that not everyone wants the same thing. So another really important concept from in our view is the idea that we segment our audiences within what's possible. Very small organisations may just have quite a simple segmentation. Very large national ones may have very complex ones because we're trying to just serve different people with different and distinct offers. To some extent, ideas about audience development have also much more recently had the idea that we involve our users in decisions about what our organisations does. That this is a really, this is a useful way of thinking about taking people on that journey. So this notion of users involved has become much more prominent, and actually, of course, that that evaluation is very much built into the way that we work. So these are the 7 principles that we'd be looking for and have talked about a lot, in various work that we've done. I think, still the most popular download from our website is How to Create an Effective Audience Development Plan, and that very much follows those 7 principles, talks about how you do that, lots of technical advice about doing it and so on. And, essentially that advice is based on this notion of a cycle, where we think about what our higher audience's aims are as an organisation. We carry out a situational analysis. We kind of think about this cycle where we sort of understand what's going on in the outside world, set our own objectives, think about our strategic development, make an action plan, which we then start monitoring and adjusting. So in theory, this is kind of what we do, but we find that, of course, in real life, this is not really what most of our audience development plans look like. They look much more like this. And so this idea that we kind of have set ourselves up to fail in some ways by suggesting this very sort of straightforward, slightly iterative process, whereas in fact, of course, it's, we tend to write our plans, put them on a shelf. We hang on to some of the big principles. We quite often get distracted by the financial objectives because they're nice and clear cut, and they're much easier for us to follow. So in some of our recent thinking, we've been trying to sort of really think about what happens in the real world, what happens to us when we're trying to, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that idea of how to do our planning. It's just that the reality of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis don't always get us very far. So we're thinking a lot about how we respond to that and building the learning and adaptation about what our audiences want much more into how we do things on a day-to-day basis, because actually the timescales we're working on, we might come back and review these things every 3 to 4 years, but actually in reality we need to be adapting and thinking about what our audiences want from us on a much more frequent basis. So that was one of the big driving ideas behind our sense about whether audience development is working. So if we look at some of those principles, in reality, we think, actually it's quite hard to sustain. As I've said, we've got lots and lots and lots of evidence about how specific projects have been really successful in attracting different audiences to the ones that we see dominate much of the sort of, particularly the funded cultural infrastructure. But it tends not to be systemic. So even organisations that do that one thing really well don't quite often, the project ends, they move on to a different community, things change and so on. Somebody who's a big champion, say, of disabled access moves away, and that organisation's ability to connect in the same way tends to drop off. So we've seen that it's hard for organisations to sustain these long-term change goals that they have, so they tend not to be systemic. And that's often, one of the reasons for that may be that actually these kind of, their big ambitions are not necessarily adopted by or embraced in a practical sense across the whole organisation. We perhaps, particularly in the UK again, because we do have to earn a lot of our own revenue, we do tend to think, are we really thinking about audience development, about our mission, or are we tending to think a bit more about markets? Actually, in theory, we're thinking about everyone that we need to engage, our full stakeholder base, but actually a lot of the time we end up actually just focusing a lot on, where the money may be coming from, and starting to think about our audiences and our stakeholders more as a revenue opportunity than necessarily as the community that we serve. Perhaps part of the reason that then is that programming and the wider experience fall out of the mix when we're thinking about how we actually develop those audiences. And although we use insight, I think we're really good at using insight and data and research, particularly in the UK. It's really interesting working internationally how much more sophisticated in many ways our work often is around using data. But nevertheless, we're not always thinking about all the things that we need to do. We might, we might be looking at, we might spend a lot of time looking at pricing information, for example, but we're not necessarily pulling everything we know about our audiences together to think about these wider objectives we have as an organisation. And as I've just been talking about, our sense of success is often selective. We're often better at loyalty than diversity. As I say, I do think there's a real issue that we've got very good at listening to our existing audiences and being in a bit of a bubble with them, and perhaps finding it more difficult to listen to people that aren't already coming. As we said, the process is much messier than perhaps we try to convince ourselves. People who write manuals like I have done, we try and the process is a bit messier than that, and we need to, I think, to embrace that more in the way that we think about working. So this is what took us into this realm of starting to think about audience-centered experience design as an alternative, or it's not really as an alternative. I think it's more of a way of working within an overarching plan, something that is much more about the day-to-day and how we really work and how we stay close to our audiences in what we do all the time. So we might still have an overarching audience development plan that sets out what we're trying to do, but within that, how do we bring that alive? And this is where we started thinking about audience-centered experience design. So what does it mean to put our audiences right at the center of our work and what we do every day? How do we bring all this data that's around us, how do we make it really insightful for us so that it can breathe our activities alive? How do we really tune in to what audiences and our communities are telling us, what they need? How do we put it front and center of our day-to-day work? Secondly, this notion of focusing on the whole experience, so not just about communications, not trying to communicate something that actually people don't really want in particular ways. How do we think about the experiences that people really want? The barriers, the benefits of what we're doing, how do we articulate those things properly? How do we understand what is a benefit and what's a barrier? But also, it may be that some things just aren't working at all, and we need to think about alternatives that work for our different constituencies. And finally, how do we apply a more of a design approach to all of this? So start thinking about understanding that we may need to iterate and adapt what we do. If we start off on a certain track and it's not working the way we want to, how can we keep that moving in a way that helps us to really get close to our audiences? How do we iterate? How do we, we understand what people's needs are, how do we learn how to respond to them, and to do that fairly quickly in a manageable way? So these are the driving ideas behind this notion of the audience-centered experience design. So focusing on the right experience as well as the right communications, so I was just saying, starting with not our needs, but starting with our potential or our audience's needs. So, we tend to think about our needs first and then sort of retrofit those onto the audience we think might be interested in them. How do we orientate a whole organization around those needs? How do we, and I think there's something very, very important idea that comes through a lot of the literature. When you look at where success has happened, it's often been because we learn how to value many different perspectives, and that's within our own organizations, as well as listening to different communities outside. We also wanted to think about how we might test our ideas with audiences before we commit to them. So the notion of with, not to, which is a very popular one, I think, these days, again, in a theoretical sense, but how do we do that practically? It sounds great, doesn't it? Let's do it with our audiences, not to them. But how do we actually make that deliverable in our day-to-day work? So again, we wanted to think about that. And one of the things that we came up with that really is an answer to that orientating the whole organization concept, how do we bring in lots of perspectives, was this very, very important idea which we've seen working, lots of interesting experiments over the years, where cross-disciplinary teams are really, really important on this ability to absorb different viewpoints, be adaptive, finding that easy. It's much easier when you have teams who are listening in different ways and bring different perspectives to the table themselves as well. And finally, we want to think about how do we encourage this approach on an ongoing basis. So all of these ways of working that I've just described on this slide, for my money, all add up to how we might move less to thinking about all the other marketers and programs and so on, and how do we all perhaps together start thinking like designers. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by thinking like designers? So I'm just going to got another little bit more theory for you around design thinking and how that interconnects with the notion of audience development, if you like. And in doing so, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Adeste Plus partnership and our development of something we call the ACE, That's right, it's an acronym for Audience-Centered Experience Design, the ACE blueprint, a model for ourselves, if you like. So it's a kind of design within a design. So the Adeste Plus partnership co-designed this particular pattern for working, this model for working, which we've chosen to call a blueprint in recognition of the fact that it's based heavily on the concept of design thinking. And I will explain what I mean by that in a moment. So one of the world's most messy slides, I apologise for that, you can dwell and have a little look at those things, but this is essentially just explaining some background. I'm not going to dwell on our lovely Adeste Plus partnership, but there's quite a lot of us. I think there are 17 partners altogether. A big core of those partners have been working together, in fact, across a number of different projects. So actually the work that we're showing you here, we've now been working on these ideas for about 8 years altogether. And what's been really interesting for us as UK based organisation is really seeing some of our work through the filter of what happens in different contexts. This notion from our point of view, we've done exactly what we said we should do, which is to look at our work from a different perspective, which has been incredibly valuable. But that's a conversation for another day about working internationally, I think. The important point is, though, here that we have been working with these organisations, and indeed with probably another 200 or so, because we've involved lots of people in some of our programmes, in summer schools, in conferences, in quite a deep way. So we've really started to build a community of interest, I think, around this way of working. Importantly, not only have we developed this programme together, with a real focus on trying to bring about systemic change within whole organisations, and focusing on scaling what works, and I think particularly we did come from a place where we were already very interested in co-design, because we'd seen that a lot of these, where it's working, where we are genuinely developing and building sustainable relationships with very, very different audiences, there's nearly always been a co-design element to that. So we were very interested in that as a group, as this is a success factor. We wanted to trust that organisations, cultural organisations, are brilliant at being creative. So we wanted to create a framework in which we could really cherish and nurture that way of working. So as I say, that has led us finally over the last 3 years to co-design this ACE blueprint. And that's now been tested and adapted with over 50 organisations. So we're feeling pretty confident that we've definitely got something here. I think jury's still out on what will be happening, whether the results of this are still going to be changing and forming organisations in 3 years' time. But certainly that we have a sense that something important has been seeded in those organisations. And poorly spelt at the moment, we'll come on at the very end, we'll share some of those resources. So the blueprint is actually documented, and we've kind of taken some of the both sort of best of some design thinking tools and put them into our sort of resource pack, if you like. It's a website with those resources on. But some of them are just really taken from things that we developed as partners that we know really work inside cultural organisations that took part in that. So that's the partnership. My main point there really is that those are our common areas of interest, and that we've developed this framework, and that it has been tested. So moving on. So just to explain my terms, there are as many definitions of design thinking out there as there are design agencies, to be absolutely honest. But here's quite a nice one. Design thinking is a non-linear, iterative process that teams use to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. So there you go, all the buzzwords all in one sentence. But essentially, the really important ideas are that you take a, that we take an idea and we kind of keep going back to it. We keep trying things out. This notion of testing things in the real world is super important, as we'll come on to. As I say, from our point of view, it's not just about thinking like a designer. It's really, and massively importantly, thinking about being not expert-led designers, but being user-centered designers. So if you this image comes up a lot, or versions of it, as a really simple visual articulation of the difference between expert-led design and user-centered design. So experts may want to do things in one way, users want to do things in another. How do we try and find some correspondence between those two things? So our interests were particularly in becoming user-centered designers. Quite often this practice is called human-centered design. So we were very interested specifically in so-called human-centered design. And I mean, people sort of say, well, what's the alternative to that? So, well, I think there's the alternative, of course, is being, you know, it's being, some humans are more expert than others, is the core idea there. Hence our use of the term audience-centered design, although I should say, very importantly, we're thinking about potential audiences as well as existing audiences. And a lot of the projects really did focus on how we kind of build relationships with, meaningful relationships with communities who are not already engaged with our organisations. So for those of you who like a model, and I do love a model, and some of you will be very familiar with this, but just bear with me, for those people who aren't, I'm just going to explain it. So really, really the underlying model of design thinking, which is such a useful, I think it's, you know, groundbreakingly useful model. It is now absolutely ubiquitous. But this was, I think this is the UK Design Council. It's quite a long time ago. My understanding of it is that they did a huge piece of research around the world, and they said they asked, you know, how do designers in all sorts of different settings actually work, whether that's service design or product design, you know, is there something really common? And they came up with this concept of this sort of 4-step process. But the important thing is that the reason it's a double diamond is this notion that you've got 2 things going on. Firstly, you have to define the understanding of what is the problem your design is trying to solve. And the second area is actually what are the potential solutions to solving that problem. And one of the issues that we quite often come across is that this does rely on problem language, and I know lots of people in our sector really dislike this kind of talking about problems. So you may find, if you're talking to your colleagues, that, you know, talking about a design brief rather than a problem definition or a challenge, we just seem to be very allergic to the notion of problems. Anyway, so first diamond is all about problem definition, and the second diamond is all about finding and testing out solutions. And why are they diamonds? So here's the other big important idea around in both spaces. We start with very divergent thinking. So we start off with lots of different ideas about what the problem might be, and then start to focus in and think about convergent thinking. But what's the important problem here? What are the important aspects of the problem, the things we really need to pay attention to? So this notion of exploding lots of ideas first, and then converging, starting to think about things coming together. And in the second space, again, trying out lots of different ideas, lots of potential ideas, and then prototyping those in order to try and work out the best ideas, the ones that are really going to help us in the future, the things that should last. So this kind of, you know, we realized when we looked at some of the projects, if we took, for example, the UK's Creative People and Places programme, which has been super successful, engaging completely different audiences, and we looked at the practice of those organisations, none of them sat down with a double diamond, but actually, if you looked at what they were all doing, it very much follows this pattern, that people spent quite a long time getting on to understand those communities where perhaps had very little publicly funded cultural infrastructure. It's been a long time understanding what might be interesting, what people might, you know, what they did like doing, what they didn't like the sound of, doing lots of go and see, for example. And then starting to think about what in their particular area they could do before actually moving on to starting to try things out. And so actually, without knowing it at all, I think lots of Creative People and Places practitioners have really adopted this way of thinking, because it mirrored, it actually made lots of, the minute they saw it, they thought, yeah, this really makes sense to us, because this is what we do, but we didn't, you know, wouldn't necessarily have thought this in the first place. So yes, we're thinking quantity of ideas, and those at the explosion point, and then quality of ideas as we move on. So in our project design for the ACE blueprint, we started to think about this notion of divergent and convergent thinking, firstly within our organisations, you know, really spending some time thinking about what's the audience problem for our organisation, who do we really want our audiences to be, and are we willing to go there? What audiences do we need? Why do we need them? And who should we be focusing on? So having quite some deep conversations about that before we even are able to move on to saying, what's the problem for those target audiences? Who do we really want to attract that we're not doing, perhaps? And then spending some real time getting to know and understand the needs of that community or set of stakeholders or potential audience, or indeed our existing audiences, before then moving on to what's the solution. So we sort of very much followed this process of divergent and convergent thinking, both within our organisations and for our audiences. And that has helped us too. And here it is in its total. This is the blueprint described. It comes in 3 phases. We've got the sort of getting ready, which is very much about getting ready inside our organisations, understanding what do we really want, you know, who are we really for, and how do we really serve that public. So preparing the space, if you like, getting ready to do the project, but also stopping and thinking about what we're really trying to do here before moving into this second experimental phase where we're trying things out with our audiences, very, very, very based on some design thinking concepts about getting to know our organisations in very deep ways, pulling together the data we know, but making it sing for us, defining the problem before we then move on to thinking about the kind of different experiences that we might prepare for people. And then the big question, as you know, that I've already raised about how we keep this way of working inside our organisations. There's something about taking the experiments we've done and making sure they have a long-term life. Once we prototyped different ways of doing things, different experiences, how do we kind of make sure that we commit to them? As well as then thinking about, but how do we make this way of working, this experimental way of working, how do we keep that going inside our organisations? So that's the blueprint, essentially, and you'll see in the resources that we'll show you what we'll point you to at the end, how they complement each of these different stages. So what's working for that? So it works, as we say, what we've seen so far from the experimentation that we've done is that this is working for our audiences. It is helping. It is very much based on you know, great practice elsewhere, but it is about saying, well, what have those organisations done when they have really made a difference, and how can we bring it into our day-to-day practice? It's very much about listening to our audiences and their needs, and that is both in terms of using the hard data at our fingertips, as well as actually getting in there and just talking to people as well. So it's a combination of quant and qual, really. And really, I think it does take us into the territory. Ideally, some of the best projects we've worked on have involved participants, audience members, community on an ongoing basis. So not just you know, coming along to try something out, but actually having long ongoing conversations with them. But it's also win-win-win for our people and staff. And one of the things that we know is that this way of working has been really impactful for organisations and for staff there as well. So we also know this is a great way of working because it really is about giving people a proper stake inside their own organisation. So we've seen that this involvement in problem solving, you know, having your ideas heard has been really powerful, I think, within a lot of organisations. And in fact, that's been some of the best impacts and the most interesting organisational learning, I think, has been about creating a fantastic culture to work in. I mean, we already had some organisations on board who were pretty good at this, but I think that, you know, developing that even further, giving it a name, has been very powerful. And finally, it's great for, you know, whole organisations, for resilient organisations, particularly through the pandemic. This form of adaptability and iterative change has become particularly important. And I think when we started the project, which was you know, pre-COVID, I don't think we realised how important some of these I suppose they are instincts and knacks have become, really, in terms of how we are able to work as organisations and respond to much more significant change than we perhaps realised right in the first place. I'm going to skip over some of those ideas, so there's lots of interesting things to be said about that, which we can return to. So just very quickly to finish off with the ideas, the key ideas that were really, really important to the programme to us. So one of the first things was, it's a word that we've used endlessly, but the part of the design process is understanding what's going on from a audience perspective, is to really start to think about being empathetic, building empathy. It's not just about using the data, it's about building true understanding, and that does mean a combination of using hard data. It's not enough to take anecdote, but it's also important to get in there and start talking to people on a regular basis. We used this tool, the sort of empathy and practice tool, this idea of building personas up. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just show you this. This is a tool that is much discussed in the blueprint, but a really useful way of pulling together everything you know about an audience and starting to build a flesh and blood character over time. Lots of advice about how you can go about doing that. So I just highlight that as a dead useful tool to come back to. All about ideas, this notion of divergent and convergent thinking and getting teams really able to think about that quickly was a super important skill that we feel that people learn as a result of it. I'm going to have a go at that in a bit. Prototyping, so trying ideas out, learning first before you really commit to things, and involving your audiences, your stakeholders, you know, whoever that group of people is that you're working with, involving them in the sort of the testing out of ideas, even if it's only a paper idea. Have a chat with people about a sort of you know, what things could look like before you do, and then sort of building up over time. This was a very different way of many organisations working. I mean, some of you will be very familiar with this, but for lots of organisations, this was the massively groundbreaking thing. When you're going to do something completely new, try it out in a minimum viable format you can first. And you know, much less might like to make mistakes, but I think also it frees people up to have great big new ideas as well. So prototyping, important idea. As I say, very, very impactful, this notion that actually it's unlocking creativity across the whole organisation, from the finance team, production teams, front of house, wherever people were working, being involved with this did have a huge impact. So this very particular format here was that the programs are all run by a task force, given different names in different places, but essentially a small group of between 6 and 10 people. Very important that they are from across a whole organisation, whether you're a museum or a theatre or whatever, that you're just kind of pulling to people who work in totally different teams together and they are empowered and given resources to make something happen. Very important. Very important that it's not hierarchical. It was important there was somebody who was the project manager to drive it forward, because everybody has their day jobs, but that the group were working, you know, in a very, very democratic way. And they become the audience champions. They're the ones who really, really build up that deep, deep understanding of a particular group's needs, and you know, really they are the champions. And of course, it's that championing activity that really helps to make these changes that they brought about last into the future. So that's me. I've gone 4 minutes over time, Johnny. I'm sorry, I've stolen 4 minutes from you. So I'm going to stop now, just having some theoretical stuff. We're very happy to come back to some of this stuff later on. In the meantime, we're just going to start to bring some of this stuff in a more practical way, and I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to do that.
Great, thank you. And can you stop sharing so I can share my screen?
Sharing with pleasure.
Great. So at the centre of this, at the centre of this whole process, we have experience, and we rather boldly put that right at the front of the description of this session: experience design and audience development. And we're just going to have a look now what it is that we're really talking about. What are we actually talking about in terms of experience? What actually is an audience experience? And it's something which is kind of implied in all our work, I think, but we actually often don't properly consider it. We concentrate a great deal on the art, let's call it that, at the center of what it is we're doing. Quite rightly, that's what we're about. But we need to remember that actually our audiences, our visitors, our users, our participants, they interact with us, they engage with what we're doing in a much more much bigger, more holistic, rounded way, the whole experience. And that is something that we'd like to have a little bit of a focus on right now. In a few minutes, we'll come back to this, but just for the moment, think about what happens when you have a cultural experience. What is actually involved in this process? Whatever that might be. I've called it cultural experience, but we could talk about heritage, we could talk about entertainment, we could talk about art, we could talk about a whole range of different things. We could talk about film, certainly. And you know, we often focus, like I say, on, you know, if we're putting on a jazz gig, we focus on what the jazz is, who they are, what important bands they've been in before, and what their latest album is. And that's the kind of information we give, and that's what we expect people to pick up on. And in fact, there are a whole range of other things involved in going to a jazz gig. Any of us who love jazz will know there's much more to it than who those players are. So we just want to have a look at, you know, what happens before, during, and after. So not just during. We will have a little bit of a look at during, because during is a very interesting aspect. But what happens before we actually, you know, I'm using the example of a venue here. So, you know, coming to a venue, having the experience in the venue. What happens before? What happens after? What do you get excited about? What is the anticipation? And the other side of that, what do we worry about? What are we worried about? And there starts to come in how that relates to audience development, of course, because there are different experiences for different people. And for some people, those experiences may not be as positive as we'd like them to be. So just have a think about it now, your own cultural experiences as an audience, not as a cultural manager, as an audience, and what it is that happened from beginning to end. And I think when we do that, when we think about that, you know, I've thrown in here a few quotations just to show that I've heard of Lady Gaga. No, so there's Lady Gaga. I love this thing. I was looking up a few things yesterday. I just am committed wholeheartedly to theatre with no intermission. There are different views, for example, on intervals and intermissions and breaks within concerts, theatre shows, musicals, whatever. You know, different people have different views. We have this lovely idea on right on the left-hand side here, The Little Prince, a piece of fiction with this idea of anticipation. And we know that a large part of what we enjoy about our experiences is the anticipation and thinking through and planning what might happen. This bottom left, the older people amongst us will remember this campaign, which I think was way back in the 1990s, actually. It was a campaign, quite a deliberate campaign by the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, which talked about an ace cafe with quite a nice museum attached. It was controversial at the time, and for obvious reasons, but what they wanted to get over, actually, if I can paraphrase it a bit, was to get over the idea that the V&A was a stuffy place with a rather boring design in it, and actually it was a nice place to go. And they had a whole series of quite humorous pieces of campaign attached to that. And then, of course, we need to remember that we are living in the world we're living in 2022, and the whole effect of the online digital sharing through social media or other formats is incredibly important. This is from a really nice project in New York, actually, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's project, where they work with people not normally that engaged in arts and culture. And they talk about the effects of the work they do, which is when they work in public spaces and the way in which that work is shared amongst other people. I was actually at a performance a couple of weeks ago where they did the traditional thing in theatres, and there's good reasons for this. It's less common in museums and galleries now, but to say please don't take any photographs, don't video it, and until you get right out of the building, and all that side of things. And that's, that's fair enough. That's very often to do with intellectual property ideas, but actually the world we live in, people expect to be able to share, to kind of think, to reflect on things afterwards with people that they might want to talk to. One of the interesting things that we've done over a period of time at the Audience Agency is we've done quite a lot of research working with outdoor arts, especially in the 2013 to 2017 phase. We did a lot of work looking at what it is that people like about outdoor arts, and why, for example, which we can show demonstrably is the case, why it's able to attract a more diverse audience, and what is it that people like about outdoor arts. One of the things that we found was that this sense of conviviality, the aesthetics of conviviality, as one person described it once, is an incredibly important part of stuff that happens outdoors in public spaces, for circus, spectacle, that sort of thing. And I put this picture in because actually I think it's maybe a little bit of a typical English seaside scenario. It's the Out There Festival in Great Yarmouth, which many of you may know, fantastic festival developed over many years. And I thought was lovely because it's even in the rain, people are having fun and enjoying the work on offer. And in fact, I've deliberately cut out what they were actually looking at, because I was thinking what's interesting is to look at them themselves. So if we think about those positive, I'm going to call them positive and negative. Of course, it's not quite as black and white as that, but If we look at some of those positive aspects, for example, the outdoor arts audiences that I was talking about, we found that the importance of social is incredibly important. Who you go with, who you meet, who you tell afterwards. And that's not to demean the art in any way. In fact, I think it's very much to enhance the art, because it's about being able to have experiences which are with other people, which kind of alters the way in which you think about it and appreciate it, and either love or hate what it is you're doing. We know this is something that's come through when we've been talking about the impact of COVID, you know, that even with online experiences of some of the things like streaming, for example, there were a number of organizations during the 2020 and 2021 that found that if you expanded it to just being not just about streaming, but about sharing your experiences and having a sense of doing it with people, like we are here today, where, you know, people are putting things in the chat, even though you're in your own individual units in different places, that's important. And this is a little bit of research on the right hand side here, which we did through Audience Finder about outdoor arts, and you can see there some really important things that came through on that about the importance of the socially motivated aspects. And in fact, one of the things that we also find is that with some parts of the cultural world which are good at engaging, attracting and engaging people who might be not so much engaged in arts and culture normally, they often are looking for these other aspects as in terms of thinking about going and what it is they're going to enjoy about it. And very often, if you think about it as well, if people are going less often, there's a sense in which they're investing more in when they do go, in having a good experience. And that good experience is not always just about the art, it's about other things as well. And, you know, there is then the issue of like, what is it that we are going to do to improve those experiences or to enhance those experiences? This is a lovely example from Santa Maria da Feira in Portugal. A very nice festival, regular festival, and this was a performance I went to which actually took place in a wood, and it was I think it's the only time I've ever been to a performance in a wood. But it was what was special about it was both the performance and also the sense of us all walking together and being together in this wood and experiencing things together and bumping into people and those sorts of side things as well. All part of an overall experience. That's some of what we're talking about. You can also have a little bit of a look here at what we might call the negative aspects. These are, I've slightly adapted some real quotations I took from focus groups that I've been involved in facilitating. I've called them non-museum and non-venue attendants, a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's effectively what they are. I can walk past them, you don't really see the sign until you get close, and then I think I must go in there sometime, someone talking about going to a museum. And then on the other hand, it can also work, I think we're very much minded of the idea that kind of an elitist idea of sort of a difficult elitist idea might be about something traditional and not for us, but it can also work the other way, which I found, which is those organizations which are super cool can also be a bit of a put off to some people. This is something that people don't always realize, you know, that a very nice bohemian, exciting, trendy venue, which we may all love as culture managers, may well be a bit of a put off to some people. I don't have any relaxed, cool clothes, so I would feel a bit odd there. And this brings us back to the point Anne was just making about empathy. You know, how do different people actually feel about it? Not what is our experience and not what does our data say about the demographics of it. How do people feel about interacting with our organizations, with our culture, with our art, with what we're doing? And crucial to this is the fact that different people have different experiences as well. This is a really important point, which we'll come back to in a minute. Experiences. So I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I thought I'd throw out something about smell. Now, that might seem, I don't know if this sounds a bit trivial, but it's not trivial at all, because I'll tell you a real life experience. I worked in a venue a few years ago, and we did a classic audience survey. We had a classic any other comments section. We weren't asking about this, but we suddenly found in this survey that lots of people said they didn't like the smell of our venue, that they felt that when they got in, what they sensed was a smell of, mainly of bleach and cleaning fluids. We hadn't worked in a venue, had almost become oblivious to this, but this was actually putting people off. And that's, got nothing to do with how great our communications is or how wonderful our art is on stage. But it's a really fundamental part of what it is that's happening. These are a couple of real examples that I've found. I've slightly altered them to protect the guilty. These are kind of parts of what it is that we do, and I'm sure you have felt this as well. And then, of course, we've got the whole COVID thing as well. How does that impact the way we experience things? This is from our cultural participation monitor. It's the Wave 6. It's actually only just going public now. I'm sorry, it's a little bit complicated. It's because it comes from a question about the difference between outdoor and indoor experiences. But you'll see how important now in this world of COVID, post-COVID, in post-COVID, however we want to think of it, how important a whole range of things are to do with how comfortable people feel about going to an event. And if we don't get this right, then I think that this is the sort of impact we might have on people. This is actually a real notice I found outside a restaurant, and I'm never work out whether it was a joke or whether it was a genuine mix-up of words. But I feel that it's somehow the way in which we sometimes the message that we give of our venues. Okay, so that's the experience. That's what we're talking about here. That's what we're considering. Obviously, the question therefore is, what can we do about it? Some things are beyond our control. So, the way in which things like that, like I've just shown about COVID, may not be in our control, but certainly there are some things that are within our control. So what is it that we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to properly understand what's happening. What is this experience that we are having? And in order to do that, this is where the design part of this comes in. We need to have the whole organization involved. So in the Adeste Plus project, when we've been working on this process, it makes a big difference, obviously, if you are working across the whole organization. Now, some of the organizations on Adeste Plus were enormous. There was one which was 300 or 400 employees. There was one which is even higher. The Goodacre in Portugal is a gigantic organization. The others very small. In the process of the waterfall, in the capacity building workshops we did in the UK, one of the most recent ones we worked with was Norwich Arts Centre, which basically has a full-time staff of about 8 people. And there are ones that are even small. So either you're talking about whole organization really, or you're talking about a team that's a sample of that. And that helps because, if you're going to talk about those things like, so we'll take that one I just mentioned about toilets, unless the person's responsible therefore about making the toilets nice and not smelly is involved in that process, or perhaps there are things which people like the technicians have noticed that we don't know, that people involved in finance even they see things, or administration, not just marketing, communications, not just education, and also the programming and artistic side of things as well, which we shall come to. So these sort of things need to be in our research and evaluation. We need to have research and evaluation in this process, which is more than just about gathering data. It's about also that empathizing and understanding that different personas, different people have and want and need different sorts of experience. And we can do this by looking at a process called user journey mapping. Many of you will be familiar with this thing, but what we do in this process is use it as part of the design thinking idea, the audience-centered experience design. And it's been very much influenced in recent times by online journey mapping, looking through websites and how that works. And some, especially commercial companies, they look at some things in much more detail, especially around direct contact, looking at customer care. So all those things that you're probably familiar with, like if you're at a restaurant and people, there's this convention that, well, it's not a convention, it's, well, there's a protocol of the way in which waiters do this thing whereby they come back to you after they serve you and say, is everything okay? And sometimes the theory is supposed to go, you get someone who is not serving you to ask that, because people, especially those of us who are from Britain, will be used to the idea that people sometimes feel too polite to make a complaint. So you need someone to kind of go and kind of find out what it is that people like. And those touch points in some organizations, they're very, very precise. You know exactly when it is you say hello to people, when you say goodbye. So in the user journey mapping scenario, we actually consider how this works. What is our experience of the whole process? Not just the middle bit, but before, during, and after. And not just about what people do, but how they feel about it. You know, how good is that experience, or what happens when when it's happening? Does it enhance or does it diminish that experience? The way the mapping thing helps us to be a bit more strategic about what it is we're looking at. So we can always look, and we can always discuss anecdotally about different things that happen in our organizations, but this helps us to look at the precise connections and understand what's happening at different points. And this point at the bottom, for different personas, is a really crucial point. I'll just come to in a second. So not just the bit in the middle, but I'm very keen. One of the things I found is often ignored in the cultural world is what happens after the event, and that's quite natural in a way, because especially those of us who come from a marketing point of view, and originally where we're like so obsessed with trying to get people into the event and enough of them and the right sort of people, that when the event happens and people look vaguely happy and go away again, we don't care anymore. But actually, that what happens afterwards is a vital part of it, and as we've looked at just now, can be important in terms of the sharing, the reflecting, and for many people that sharing thing is an actual vital part of the experience. And I don't think we should be patronizing about that. I know that there's a big debate often about the obsession, I don't know, obsession of selfies at museums and galleries. That's what that lovely first picture from the Belgian Convict Museum was talking about. But I think we have to recognize that the world we're in, that's part of the experience that people are having about culture, and we have to think about how are we going to enhance this. And just to mention here before we kind of look at our own experiences, so this is something I realized recently on working on 1 or 2 projects, that actually one of the big mistakes I've noticed about user journey mapping is that people do a generalized user journey mapping for an organization and its audience in general. That's good, that's better than nothing, but the really crucial thing is to understand that different people have different experiences and have a different journey, and different points are important there. And unless you understand the differences of those user journeys, then you're not really seeing the full picture. You're not getting the importance, and then you're not really having that part of understanding what it means for audience development. So on the Adeste website, which we'll show at the end, there is a template which shows some of what it is you do. But here, I want you to kind of have a quick go, give you 10 minutes to have a go at sketching your experience. So I asked a few minutes ago for you to consider a cultural experience you had as an audience member recently. And I thought it would be fun, so that we stop whittering on and you have a go, that I want you to have a think about that experience And on a piece of paper, if we want to be good and old fashioned, or if you want to do it on a computer screen, or that's harder to share with us in a minute, divide it into 3 sections: before, during, and after, and map out your own user journey. Write down any key points you remember, especially when you interacted with the organization, and which were better and which not so good. So in this diagram I just showed here very briefly, part of this is the smiley thing is about, you don't have to use smileys, but it's about understanding which parts were good or bad, because that's what helps us to understand it. And you being artistic people, feel free to express your ideas graphically. Going to give you 10 minutes, and you've got a choice really. We're asking you to do this on your own, and you can do this on your own for 10 minutes. We're also going to use this as an opportunity to say that if you want to take a break, please do it now. We're not going to have an official break apart from this. We're going to carry straight on to the top of the hour. So, but what you could do is spend 10 minutes 5 minutes drawing and describing, and then take a break as well. And what we're going to try and do when we come back is, if anyone feels particularly pleased with their maps, their diagrams, and wants to do it, we will show 4 or 5 to the rest of the group. So completely optional, of course. That's what we'll do. That's
great? Sounds great, Jonathan. Should we? So, if you'd like to take a break, do your user journey and take a break now, and we will reconvene at 15 minutes past 2 UK time. So back here at 14:15. Please feel free to sketch a user journey of a recent cultural experience while you're having a break, or just have a break, whichever you prefer. And we'll see you back here at 14:15. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Move on. So we're going to come on and think now a little bit about designing experience, and we're going to try doing some breakouts in a minute. So prepare yourselves for that if you'd like to take part. So next bit. So we're now going to think about a real situation for our lovely colleagues at the Nordbro Theatre in Copenhagen, who have been fantastically brilliant at modelling the ACE process and have totally adopted it and taken it to heart, and we'll tell you a little bit about their story as we go through. But without more ado, I'm going to just dive into having a go at doing some of this tough stuff practically. I'm going to just take you through a bit of thinking for the Nordbro Theatre. And Nordbro is about a 500-seater. It's close to the middle of Copenhagen, but it's it's got quite a hinterland to it. It's in the middle of a community. It's actually a comedy theatre. I think everything they do is broadly related to comedy rather than anything else, but I don't think that has particular bearing on what we're going to talk about now. Anyway, nice place, nice people, very creative and very collaborative, even more so now. So this is really an example of starting where our audiences are. And in fact, I'm going to just show you a process that they went through, where in fact they were taking some inspiration for some rather generic research that was done by a local agency, a bit like the audience agency actually in Copenhagen, who'd done some generic research about audiences. And then they went through on a bit of a process where they did some more specific research not about audiences in general, theatre audiences in general. Then they did some work around their own audiences and what their own audiences were saying. And then they started to have some really great, straightforward, qualitative and empathetic conversations with their audiences. But that's a story I'm going to tell you a bit later. We're just going to dive in and look at some of the specifics of that research. So the local agency, Applause, had done some generic research talking to the population, people in general who were theatre goers, or who were lapsed theatre goers rather, and they asked people why they didn't go to the theatre anymore, or why they didn't go very often. And here are some of the things that people said. So they said, well, the weather's just too nice at the moment. Well, other people said, well, the weather's too bad, that puts me off going. They're bad plays, it's too expensive, a lot of the things that we know. The identity, the visual identity of the theatre is too elite, I can't afford it, the parking's not very good. I don't know the actors, poor service, all things that we know quite a lot about. Incidentally, these are very, very common themes, and if you do any research anywhere, these are very, very common things. You'll probably recognise some of them. My husband is too boring to come out was one answer. They liked all of these things. The plays are too long. What's that one? No one something or other. Oh no, sorry, that's a really important one. I don't know what it's about. Don't know where to buy tickets. Sorry, I've just missed the really, really important one there. But the important one was that they really picked up on, gotta go backwards, sorry, was no one to go with. So let's just go back. I set it up underneath. So the big issue was that some people said that they had no one to go with. And I'll tell you that some research that we did a few years ago about why people had specifically been quite frequent attenders and had dropped off. The most significant reason, and this was in a really big sample, the most significant reason that people said they no longer went, so the most significant reason for lapsing was that they no longer, the person they usually went with, they had someone to go with. So they, like us, knew that this was quite a significant issue, and they decided to try and do something about it. So in the ACE blueprint, we ask you at the point at which you've understood that there's a specific problem to solve, we start asking ourselves this question: how might we? So how might we is a dead useful question. So we're going to ask you to dive in and answer a how might we question. And we're going to ask you to do it in a little group, because as we've just been saying, it's really good when you've got more heads than one. So we're going to ask you to go through a how might we exercise right now and to try and answer this question on behalf of the Northborough Theatre. So have a go. This is complicated, bear with us, it's going to work. So in a group, we're going to put you into breakout rooms in a moment. In a group breakout, we'd like you to, with your colleagues in the same group, to answer the question: how might the Northborough Theatre create an experience for people who have no one to go with? So I'm going to post a link into the Jamboard in a moment. And then once you're in your breakouts, if you click on the link to the Jamboard, you'll find that there are a number of different Jamboards in there. They look a bit like this. Whoops. You should find a Jamboard that's going to look like that. It'll say there's a group up there at the top. You'll see that it says 1 of 12, and there are 12 frames altogether. Group 1 needs to work on frame 1. Group 2 needs to work on frame 2, and so on. That makes sense. So it should look like that. So we'd like you to go into the Jamboard, introduce yourself to everybody else in the group. Make sure that everyone knows how to add a post-it, and help them if not. Somebody might not be able to, in which case could you write it for them? But if everybody adds post-its, that's helpful. We'd like you to get as many ideas as you can onto that Jamboard. After 10 minutes, and we'll put a little 10-minute prompt in, can you try and choose one idea as your best group idea, and can you post it onto frame 12? And if you can, put a little explanation as to why that is. So just to go through that again, we're going to put you into breakout groups. Your breakout group will have a number. Use the Jamboard with the same number. Introduce yourselves to your colleagues. Make sure everyone can add a post-it, and then go for it. Get as many ideas down as that question: how might Northborough create an experience for people who have no one to go with? And then after 10 minutes, we'll give you a little prompt, and please put your best idea, got to agree that as a group, into frame 12. We will be doing prizes for the group that has the most suggestions. I'll explain how we're going to do that later. So are you ready? I've got to get chat open, and I'm going to post the Jamboard link there. Adam, standing by, are you ready? So it's 14:32 now. You've got exactly 15 minutes. So 10 minutes to come up with some ideas and 5 minutes to choose one. Are you ready? So we'll be getting back together again at 14:17. Here we go, at 14:47 rather, sorry, can't do that. 48, I think now. Right, everyone, here come the breakouts. But so here we go. We've got buddy scheme, pairing volunteers with isolated people or those with access requirements. Loving that. So actually brokering a buddy scheme. or creating an app with possibility to link people looking for companions to go with and share on social media newsletters or customer database. So again, the idea of a brokerage, fantastic. The club, this idea of a club, which I think if you go, I think that's on, was that the final idea that made it through? I think that's the group that's got group 6.
Yeah, that was the main idea, and like the club would be lots of elements of the things we talked about already.
That's really clever, because there were lots of great ideas in the club notion as well. God, I want to work with all of you. Fantastic. And then create spaces where interactions are encouraged, spaces for taking photos where you ask another person to take the picture for you post-show or post-show discussions. So I think, again, that's sort of a flavour of a few things. I'm loving how you did that. I'm so impressed that you've managed to do it. And I'm just going to, that is just brilliant. By my count, the people on group 1 and the people on board 4 were joint tied with 17. Jonathan, I'm leaving you, of course you can cheat, but I'm leaving you to do a final count up while I stop.
Okay, yeah, I thought group 6 has quite a lot as well, actually.
Right, you tell me.
Apologies, group 2 posted on group 1 because we followed straight away. We've put group 2 in brackets behind everything that's group 2.
Well, in that case, we might have to go with group 4, but I wondered whether that had happened or not, but I wasn't quite sure. But it was a bit of an experiment there, but I have to say, wonderfully fulfilled, excellent stuff. I'm just going to come on to it. We'd have a look at that. Can you see my screen again? But I'm just going to say, so if you are in the winning group, and Jonathan's going to announce which one that is, understanding that group 1 and 2 got a bit muddled up there, could you, and if you would like to receive a slightly tongue-in-cheek jokey prize, which we haven't decided about yet, but if you'd like to put your email address in the chat, we will record that and send you a prize. The reason for doing the prizes is this. It was making a serious point, though, that in that sort of ideation, divergent thinking phase, what is really important is to incentivize people to just have as many ideas as possible. So really encourage the idea of playfulness. It doesn't matter, you know, that the old rules of brainstorming, doesn't know wrong ideas, that kind of idea, but playfulness, getting people to be inventive, to relax, not to worry that their ideas aren't serious enough, not to worry whether they're practical or not. All those kinds of ideas are really important, which is why literally doing things like having as many ideas, incentivizing it, just encouraging people to be, you know, to go wild is very important. And if we were doing this in a real environment, you know, we quite often get people to do silly things first to sort of lose their inhibitions, short of buying every bottle of wine, of course. Anyway, that idea that the divergent thinking and convergent thinking are very different. And I think interestingly about divergent thinking, some people prefer that phase to others. You'll notice the people that like the divergent ideas because they like having lots of different ideas, and other people find that really uncomfortable. They keep going, yeah, but that's a stupid idea, that won't work. And other people really want to be in the convergent, what's actually deliverable, what can we do, stop wasting time with it. So you've got this mix of different preferences in the room. Everybody gets their turn, if you like. And I don't know how easy, but I think it's amazing that you really did stick to the discipline of coming up with one idea each, because that is really hard to do. And I don't know, and I love that whoever came up with the idea of doing the spot stickers, bloody genius. That's just fantastic. But again, you know, finding a way of being democratic in that amount of time, blooming brilliant. But of course, that you probably started to have a conversation there about, well, what criteria are we going to use to select the best idea? And of course, again, that is a critical moment of the convergent thinking thing, is really to start saying, well, what ideas matter? Is it practicality? Is it deliverability? Is it being close to what our people actually want? And you'll find some tools on the Adeste blueprint to help you think about how to form criteria and how to start to be able to select best ideas. But this idea about, you know, obviously we all do a lot of ideation, brainstorming stuff and post-its in our work all the time, but I don't know how clear it is to you, this different about whether when you're in the divergent mode and within the convergent mode, but we found this discipline of understanding which one you were doing when and why was an incredibly useful part of the process. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if it wasn't fun, it wasn't any good. So I hope for future reference, I'm sure you've done lots of those things in the past, but again, putting into the design frame, I hope that was useful and interesting. So I'm just going to finish off now, really, you'll be glad to know, with what did Honourable actually do about No One to Go With. So They came up with an idea which is remarkably, you will, oh no, go back. They came up with an idea that was remarkably similar to what you've come up with. I just need to move that thing out of the way. I can't see my own slides. Yes, there it is. So they came up with something that they called Good Company. The Good Company is what it's called, and it's the Danish copy there is for you if you sometimes lack someone to come to the theatre with. The features are, it's a free membership scheme, it's normal ticket prices, you don't have to book a series, there's a reserved area in the theatre for those people to sit together, there's an optional after show drinks, and it's not a singles night. They've done a lot of iterations around this. One, they changed the name from the Thursday Club to be more explicit. 300 people now take place, now book a ticket for every single one of their shows, which is for a small theatre like that, that's one performance sold just on that. That is a developing community. They've actually been working with quite a lot of the members of that community on some other things recently, which has been really interesting. So they've just done a whole load of access work, and lots of people from this community have helped them to do that, because they've become very close friends of the theatre. They've changed it so you can introduce other people to the club, and those, as I say, those people who are in it are actually really active in the theatre, and they've become very good hosts. And what's really interesting is that this approach that they've adopted for that particular Good Company thing, they really detailed that work after. So they were triggered by that initial no one to go with thing, but since then they have really developed a relationship and built up lots and lots of insight around Charlotte, a particular persona who really is their guiding light. So they've brought together some of the quantitative information they had, some of the survey stuff that they've done, with getting to know people in that group. And so they have this idea of persona. They very carefully think about the Good Company is designed around her needs and so on. As she said, it's not, and what they realized was that she wasn't, being on your own doesn't mean to say that you're a single looking for love, which I think sometimes people have leapt to. It was very important that she felt she was part of the community. That's what she's really enjoyed about it. It's not, she's good at organizing things for other people. It's just that she's more of an enthusiast than more of her friends. She doesn't want the hassle of having to organize things every time. So they really built this much deeper understanding, which it seems that all you guys jumped to some of these things straight away, which I think is really smart. But they really have adapted that program over quite a long period. That's been really interesting from that point of view. Really interesting again by actually doing it and trying out these nights, and not, they didn't wait until they had the perfect thing. They just put it out there. They tried the Thursday Club. They kept iterating. By doing it, they were able to sort of really challenge some of their own thinking. Again, I'm not going to talk at length because we're coming to a close now, but this idea of we really like this double loop learning, that sometimes when you actually try something out, you have this real benefit of, you don't just keep doing the same thing without adapting it, but when you sort of can try something out in a kind of tested in a real world way, when you really involve people in their feedback, you get to much better solutions, essentially, because you're not just kind of trying to, you might change your goals because you understand that actually Charlotte's issue wasn't about being single and her husband, wanting to find love or anything like that. Her issue was the fact that her husband didn't like going and she couldn't be bothered to keep organising things for other people, for example. So you come to a better conclusion. So for those of you who like those models, you can come back to that. Interestingly, Nora, as we said, had lots of other issues, and they've developed actually a whole load of different formats specifically to address some of those other issues. So they've got some really nice things. They look beautiful, but the translations are things like this question of either or. Two authors are that they've got something that's an audience deciding format, which is really interesting about sort of which is the most relevant playwright, because they wanted to go back to this issue of relevance and so on. Community singing is really big in Denmark, so they have several community singing formats. Again, we'll leave this with you to have a look at we'll share this slide to look at some of the things that they've done. But again, really addressing some of the issues they found out, and really importantly, thinking about the different segments in their audiences and having something on for them. Interestingly, all these events all fit around their usual programming schedule. So they still do a 7 o'clock show, but now they fit things in at different times of the day. So it's quite a small space, but they're massively exploiting all the opportunities they have within their quite limited asset base. So that's one of their criterion for choosing things is, can we do it around like our core program? Can we do it within our existing staff? So some really lovely ideas, and you'll recognize all developed through this process that we've just been talking about. Anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed that and found in diving in and doing some of it, perhaps more of that in the future, really useful. As I say, you will find we've just got our sort of prototype of our Blueprint website with all the tools and a growing bank of the stories of people's case studies and so on that we've just been talking about are up on that website. And we do encourage you, please go and have a look at it, and do please give us some feedback. What else would be useful? A lot of the tools, as I say, are there. We'd also like to know whether you would find doing a really properly interactive program, a bit like the one we've just had a very skimming the surface go at today. We'd like to know if this is something that you would find interesting, useful to go much deeper and do a longer program around, because we're wondering if it's something that we would like to offer in the future. So you will, of course, in a moment get a feedback form sent to you. I think there's one going up in the link now. Adam, am I right in thinking?
Yeah, and also we'll try and share some of that with you, the Jamboards and the maybe a place for you to put up some of your user journey graphics if you'd like to.
So we will be doing some follow-up, but again, so do please give us some feedback about this session. Tell us if you'd like to know some more of it, and please do try out some of these resources. Meanwhile, thank you all of you who've lasted the course and been excellent good sports, and we will try and get some prizes to any of you who have left us an email address. Thank you all. It's been great seeing you, and hope to see you another one of these soon. Thank you very much indeed. You've been marvellous. Cheers. Bye-bye.